Hello and welcome to another episode of Deconstructed, where we take an old WatchMojo top 10 and then break it down entry by entry to see why things placed where they did and discuss. Today is the top 10 influential game mechanics. Now, this isn't positive or negative, it's right down the middle, so we're gonna have a lot to talk about. Let's take a look at the entries. Okay, like I always say, plenty to talk about there. So let's meet the panel first. We got Andrew, who is a senior video editor and scriptwriter here at MojoPlays. And we've also got Justin, who I think you started as an intern, right?
Yeah, started from the bottom.
But now you're essentially a senior script editor now.
Yeah, that's right.
All right.
All the way to the top.
All the way, yeah, I think you're hitting the ceiling right now, you know?
Gotta burst through. Gotta make it through.
Best of luck with that. Okay, so let's get right into the discussion. We got lots to talk about. All right, entry number 10. Let's get this rolling. Retrieving your corpse. Now we've got Dark Souls here as our main visual aid, but I think this goes back to something like
WoW.
No, not WoW. Well, like EverQuest and early MMOs, where you would really be screwed if you died in a bad place and you'd have to go get it. And that's something that Dark Souls definitely adopted. Now,
in a different way, though, because you weren't dropping your equipment, you were dropping your currency.
Yeah, you were dropping
which was
your
used
experience.
your experience, right, which is the game's currency.
Correct. Now, it's funny because in retrospect, or like now with a few years more of just experience, we could say that like there's been a lot of Souls-like games that have come out. Like it's essentially, you can say Souls-like, and people understand immediately what you say. So you can't say that's not influential. I'm just not sure. It's influential in the way that like something like the Battlegrounds, the PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds system has become very influential like this year. Mm-hmm. So I think it was influential for kind of like a big flash in the pan, but I'm not even sure if I would include this mechanic on the list anymore.
It's fair at 10, but I think it's like a good mechanic to have on the list just because it solves a big problem for a lot of these games. Like for MMOs, handling death is not an easy thing.
Right.
And for them to come up with a system that basically both like makes death a big deal and makes it so that it's easy to understand how to bounce back and kind of get back to where you're starting. It's a difficult thing to do, and I think they really nailed it, and that's probably why we see so much of it in these MMOs. And Dark Souls adapted that in a kind of single player. There's PvP in Dark Souls obviously, but they adapted it in a single player way that I think is actually really helpful. And
what's sort of interesting is though that like it's kind of flipped. Like MMOs are heavily focused on not punishing you too much for your mistakes these days, whereas single player games are now really pushing to punish the crap out of you for screwing up because of these very popular games.
But it's different though, because in an MMO, it's more, oh no, if I die, it's going to cost me some time. Whereas in Dark Souls, when you die, it's almost like you're doing a completely different mission. Now your mission is to get to the spot where you died and get your corpse back, and you're no longer doing whatever else you were already doing. You know.
So would you say that it's actually one mechanic in the end, or is it two?
I would say it's one mechanic, but it's just
used in a bunch of different ways.
It's used in a bunch of very different, and I would keep it at 10.
Yeah, I think it's right where it needs to be.
Okay, well let's move on to 9 and see if that changes your minds. Okay, so morality systems. Now, I think earlier in the discussion we were talking about how, you know, some of these mechanics don't seem as influential nowadays as they did back when we ranked it, and I think the morality system is a big example of that. Like, for a while, every RPG had this, like, you could do the good thing or the bad thing.
Not even RPGs, it made it over into like action games.
Yeah, like Infamous and stuff like that. But I think sort of users' awareness of how much of a binary that shit was became that hit really hard, and now you just don't see these anymore. 3 years ago, you got The Witcher 3, and that game, sure, there's moral choices to make, but they definitely aren't grading you on like how much towards the dark side you are.
No, you're not just making the clearly good one or the clearly evil one and getting either like a dickish outcome or the heroic outcome.
Right.
Yeah. It has more like The Witcher is a good example of how morality has kind of changed the way at least that game developers are implementing it in their games. Is like if you make a choice in The Witcher, it affects the world and not your character.
Yeah.
And versus like in something like in Fable, right? Like when you make a negative choice,
it's all your character.
You grow some horns and stuff. In Mass Effect, it unlocks new dialogue options. Like the more of an asshole you are, the more of an asshole you can be, basically.
Yeah, it's just like you didn't have enough asshole practice to be a real asshole.
Exactly, yeah.
I just feel like this is kind of on the way out, so I say that I'm not sure that it would be on the list anymore. Although it did influence a large spurt of games in the late 2000s, I'd say.
For sure. And it's kind of
Your
been
BioShocks.
Yeah, it's been a bit of a crutch for game storytelling for a long time, where it's just like there's a good ending and there's a bad ending. And that's interactive storytelling, baby. That's what it's all about. But there's a little more to it than that, and it's a bit of a crutch to be like, yeah, sure, our game's interactive. There's 2 endings.
Yeah, screw that.
Yeah.
All right, moving forward. Okay, so what I would say about climbing / parkour. Let's get that soundbite in here.
Parkour!
Cool. Now, our example is outdated, but I don't think we've seen the end of this.
See, I actually disagree.
That our example is outdated.
No, well, yes, but I also disagree that it's not that it's on the way out. It's just, unlike the morality system or a lot of the other gameplay systems we're going to see come up,
Right.
this never left its genre. I mean, we got like Dying Light and Mirror's Edge, right, which are sort of unique games.
Okay.
But otherwise, it stayed in the third-person adventure genre, and games are still using it, but the games that use it are a very specific game. We don't see it in Far Cry, right? We don't see it in just games that aren't Prince of Persia, Assassin's Creed, or an Arkham kind of game.
Well, that's sort of why I would say, first of all, I'd say it's extremely influential because it's kind of a mechanic that has permeated the entire action open world genre. And I don't think it's fully run its course. You look at something like Breath of the Wild, and Breath of the Wild, the thing that makes that game a really special open world, in my opinion, is that you can really climb up and over everything in it.
Yeah, well, Conan Exiles just came out, and Conan Exiles is an open world survival game, and it has it too. But it's the parkour, like the climbing stayed, but the parkour sort of went away, and it even got simplified. Like newer Assassin's Creed games and stuff, while the parkour is just cooler because of modern animations and everything.
Right.
It's not as complex as it used to be in terms of like what it's going to let you climb, and now you just sort of run up anything that's a flat surface.
But that's the thing, right? Like in games like Assassin's Creed, there are spots where you can climb and spots where you outright cannot climb. And I think as unrealistic as it kind of is in Breath of the Wild, where you can just like start going up a wall, it doesn't matter if there's a little ledge for you to hang on to. It's determined by your stamina. I think that's actually kind of a good thing ultimately for like climbing mechanics, because it gives a little bit more player freedom, and it makes it like when I find something in Breath of the Wild because I climbed something I didn't think I could climb, it was like a discovery, right? But if you climb something in Assassin's Creed, more or less you're like, all right, I found the thing I was supposed to climb and I climbed it. So I think that adds an element of like explorability and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think it really it helps immerse, it sounds kind of cliche, but climbing mechanics kind of help you immerse in the world, because I often feel when I'm playing a game, I'm in a laser tag arena where it's dressed up to look like a cool place, but the walls are solid. Right. You can't affect anything in the world. You can't damage anything.
And there's nothing right outside.
And there's nothing outside. Right. Whereas I think climbing gives the world dimension in a way that I don't think other mechanics have.
Well, it's a great mechanic. I just don't think it's as influential.
So quick, fast, before we move on. Still on the list, off the list, maybe a bit down, maybe a bit up. Andrew first?
Oh, just like down, like 9, 10.
Okay.
I think it's at a good spot. I almost wish it was more influential. I'd like to see these kind of mechanics in more games.
I'd like more of the bracketed parkour part.
How cool would it be if you could actually climb a mountain in Skyrim instead of awkwardly trying to run up it at spots
doing
where
that little
allowed
jump
to.
where you're like, oop, no, not quite.
Just
Skyrim
pushing
is
up
special,
against
man.
it.
Skyrim is special.
We can all agree on that.
Okay. Okay, so this is the portion of the show where I've got to remind everyone that we're not talking about our favorite mechanics or mechanics that we think are just the best for gaming. We're talking about influential mechanics. And almost more than anything else we've talked about yet, I feel like these mechanics, wait number of hours or pay real money, have really permeated the scene they arrived in and come to define that scene. That is free-to-play mobile games.
Yeah.
And I hate them.
Yeah, I don't think there's many people that would defend the concept of paying money to advance in a game, though there are plenty of people that do it.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone's arguing that like this is a good thing for games. Maybe I'm wrong. In the comments, if you think this is the best, let me know. What's interesting about this entry is the way it's kind of mutated into AAA games. Like in games like this, it's literally a counter, right? You can sit here and wait for exactly 60 seconds or pay money and get crystals or whatever. But then you look at games like Battlefront 2 and Shadow of War, where items that are hidden behind story beats or experience points can just be purchased. And that's a kind of way of buying time if you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, that comes back to why people started to buy gold in World of Warcraft. If I'm spending this much time, like my time is actually worth money. So I'm willing to spend $20 to get, 20,000 gold in game because that literally saves me some money. Saves me some time.
You're not talking about yourself. You're talking
No.
other
That was
people.
other people did that. I never even got an epic mount, okay? I quit before burning Legion. It just really one thing that I will point out that kind of makes this outdated, and they're not really the same thing, but we weren't talking about loot boxes when we made this list. The word loot box wasn't really in our consciousness as a dirty word, let alone a gameplay mechanic.
Right.
So I think that would actually maybe replace this.
I think so too.
In a modern list, but you can't say that the practices of this sort of game have not been influential, not just in the mobile market, but in the AAA market, as you said, Justin.
And like to the detriment maybe of gaming, but nonetheless, that's a powerful influence. Money is a powerful influence. Who knew?
Who'da thunk it? So continuing with our theme of influential mechanics that are kind of on their way out because people are super duper aware of them, but that also definitely influenced a huge amount of games that we've all played recently. We got quick time events. Press X not to die. And we've very cleverly tied this all the way back to Dragon's Lair. So first God of War, you're on notice. You didn't invent nothing.
No, Shenmue. This
Shenmue.
predates Shenmue.
Yeah, Shenmue. Anyway.
Yeah, okay. There's a couple of things on this list that I would take off or move down because they're not as current anymore. Because since we ranked this list, new stuff has sort of replaced it and they've gone away. However, this was so influential and permeated like every genre of gaming, except like real-time strategy.
They went kind of hand in hand with the push to make games more cinematic.
Yeah.
Because you can have your character flip off the dragon's back and then spin and gouge, and all you have to do is X.
Yeah. But because this was so influential, I would still keep it on the list and keep it where it is on the list, even though we're not really seeing it anymore. It was so freaking huge, and I don't think they're never gonna completely go away.
I don't think so either. And like you look at games that like people are genuinely excited for, like the new Spider-Man game that's coming out, which for all like it seems like it's gonna have QTs based on the trailer. People don't seem to mind it all that much. I mean, there are people who are like, why are there QTs in my games? But ultimately, if they're just there to make cutscenes interactive, like if you're gonna sit and watch a cutscene anyway, and there's a way to make it slightly interactive, ultimately it is a bit silly and unnecessary, but why not?
I mean, that ruins the sort of like how I consume a game. I mean, this is getting a little kind of up my own butt, but basically when I am watching a cutscene, I often take my hands off the controls. Put the controller down, take my hands off the keyboard, and I just watch. Like, if I'm actually gonna watch the cutscene, I want to watch it properly because, like, I often don't watch cutscenes. So if I'm gonna take the time to actually watch it,
Dan skips a lot of cutscenes.
I skip cutscenes, man. So like, often I would find myself watching, and then it's just like, whoa, X. Yeah. Like, what is that?
That's fair.
We're getting really into personal gripes here.
No, but that makes sense. I mean, look, you made a good point before when you said it makes games more cinematic, and I think that's actually like a pretty poignant metaphor for the fact that like the more cinematic a game is, the less of a game it can be in a way.
By definition.
By definition. So like, if people's reaction to quick time events is that we don't like them because they remove control from the gamer's hands, I think that's ultimately a positive thing for game designers to take into consideration. And maybe we'll start seeing games kind of develop their own storytelling language outside of just make it cinematic,
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, like I said before, I think players are kind of wise to what's happened. So I don't think these are good in the next few years. I don't think you're going to be seeing too many of these, especially in like really popular games. Okay, aiming down sights. Now here's the question I posit to you guys. Can this really be considered a gameplay mechanic simply because it just seems like the natural evolution of the way guns work? Like, when first-person shooters first came on the scene, you never had to reload your guns. But as everyone knows, like guns don't have unlimited ammunition, so like around the Half-Life era, you started to have weapons that you had to reload. And then soon after, your Call of Duty started to introduce, although we were talking before, and we can't figure out which is the first game to implement this, but the aim down sights thing. This just seems to me like a way that guns work, so they're just kind of weaving that into the game, let alone inventing a new mechanic.
I mean, you're right, but I think it just goes hand in hand. It's like they've made games simulate the way guns sort of work more in real life, but developers of the games have also turned that into a mechanic in itself by using iron sights versus hip fire to help balance the way a gun works in the situations you should use a gun in.
Okay, I agree and disagree with you. I disagree with your example because that's like, that's just like if you're like firing from the hip versus aiming down the sights. Like, yes, those are cool mechanics for the game, but that's just mirroring how guns work in real life, right? Like you're going to have more accuracy if you're aiming down your sights.
I think what makes this one particularly
Hold on. I had another, but I agree with him in so much that like there are hidden mechanics folded into it. Like in Call of Duty, especially if you're playing on console, there's a decent amount of auto aim, and the snap, like you snap to a target even if you're not pointing at it when you pull up your sights, and that's like just very subtly hidden things. So maybe.
Well, but it's still. But you're saying it's not a gameplay mechanic because it coincidentally.
No, but I mean the
functions
being
like
able
real
to
life.
fold the auto aiming in to this real life mechanic, like because I'd say the auto aiming, that's a game mechanic. That's the game specifically pulling some strings behind the scenes to make things easier and more enjoyable for you. The aiming down the sights, that's just like that's just a regular thing that people actually do. Justin, you had a point and I cut you off.
I think that like a good example to look at when you're talking about aiming down the sights is the difference between Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas.
Oh yeah.
Which in Fallout 3, if you haven't played it, you cannot aim down the sights.
Only VATS.
You can VATS, or you can take your chances and try and shoot people from the hip. And in New Vegas, they implemented aiming down the sights, which completely changed the way that combat basically worked in that game, because I found myself in New Vegas relying on VATS a lot less often.
I almost never used it in New Vegas.
And
it was
made
so much fun.
It made the game a lot more fun. So I think that's like a big example of how it is in fact a mechanic, because when we see developers not use it, it can take away and completely change the dynamics. Because ultimately, New Vegas and Fallout 3, from an engine perspective, are very similar, practically the same game.
Yeah.
But you add in an element, a mechanic of aiming down the sights, and it changes the way the combat completely works.
I would almost call that a feature instead of a mechanic, but rather than get bogged down in terminology, I think we should move forward.
Fair enough.
All right. Okay, so just before we actually started rolling, Justin mumbled to himself that he doesn't like this one. Neither do I, but let's get to you first. What's happening here, John?
It's boring. I mean, it looks really cool and it looks realistic, and I get why like it became so popular.
Right.
But it's boring. You're basically just waiting for your enemy to make a mistake. You're waiting for them to pop their head out so that you can pop your head out and shoot them in the face. I do like the way that it's kind of grown over the years. Like if you look at the difference between, say, Mass Effect 1 and Mass Effect 2, and the way the cover shooting works in there. In Mass Effect 1, it's a waiting game. You're just waiting for an opportunity. But in Mass Effect 2, you could jump over stuff, jump to different cover, move around a little bit more freely. But ultimately, you're fixing on a point, and it just takes out all the dynamic elements of shooting, I find.
I'm a little split on this. If you asked me at the time when we ranked this, I think it's good for helping you feel like your character is in danger, because you physically see them crouching and it helps with a little bit of immersion, if you ask me. However, I know the reason this mechanic was put into these games. There's a reason it became so popular in the Xbox 360, PS3 era. It's so you could have shooters without auto aim on console and have people aiming with their thumbs. Now, I'm going to get
But
some
you don't have
back.
to move and shoot at the same time.
It's so you don't have to move and shoot at the same time. And often you can actually set your y-axis, like where you want at like the same level every time. So you're and you can slide back and forth on a regular plane to line up the rest of the shot. Like you can, move along the wall. So basically it just makes aiming in frantic shooters so much easier. Now, there is documentation about this. I'm not just pulling it out of my ass. Basically because every other first-person shooter on consoles has some kind of hidden auto-aim.
Right.
Again, I'm sorry, but that's documented. Halo, for instance. Halo, when you start firing at an enemy, your bullets are kind of magnetic. They kind of bring your gun in line with your dude. I just think that this is a mechanic that oversaturated the market, if that makes any sense. People it felt like you were playing the same game.
Exactly, and fundamentally that's exactly the problem with it. It's as soon as if you played all 3 Gears of War, and then you get an Uncharted game, I guess, because you just own both consoles, you feel like once it gets to the combat, you're just like, oh my god, I've done this 1,000. Wait for his head, hide, wait for his head to pop up, pop his head, shoot him, and it's just. But
that's why I bounced off of The Last of Us. I was like, oh look, cover shooter against dudes. I'm out.
Yeah,
that's why the zombie parts of that game are the best parts, right? Because you got to actually get up close and interact and try and move around.
Not use a cover system.
Yeah.
Maybe
But
they should have led
in
with
Mass
that.
Effect, it's really, really good though. Like Mass Effect, I can't crap all over this system too much because in Mass Effect, especially 2 and 3, they do a really good job at finding a compromise between making it run and gunny and necessitating taking cover.
Here's the thing. Mass Effect, all 3 of them, not the 4th, super good games. I love those games to pieces. Gears of War, also super fun games. And I think they succeeded in a lot of the goals they were trying to do in making things cinematic. I just feel like, those are just examples of games that did it well. And you can't deny, again, we're talking about how influential the mechanic was. This mechanic dominated that era.
Yeah.
Like from the Xbox 360 all the way up to the Xbox One, which is about the time that we launched this list. Everything was a third-person cover-based shooter. Everything. So influential.
So maybe keep it on the list, but put it down.
Oh, it definitely deserves to be on the list. It's just not a favorite of mine.
Yeah.
Not a fan.
On the subject of mechanics that were brought in to make aiming and camera work easier on consoles, we have Z-targeting, aka lock-on. Now, quick question, would we call it Z-targeting or Z-targeting if we were to do it today, or would it just be
Definitely
lock-on?
Just lock on.
Yeah, just lock-on mechanic. I think that's what everybody calls it, a lock-on mechanic. For those who don't know, Z-targeting because it was popularized by Legend of Zelda, and you hold on to Z.
Right, I think that's what's happening in this picture here. Yeah, I mean, do we really have to talk about why lock-on is such an influential mechanic? Every game uses it.
Yeah.
A lot of games that involve combat use it. One of my favorite examples of a lock-on camera is actually Rocket League, where you can lock onto the ball and you kind of have to decide what scenarios it's better to lock onto the ball and what scenarios it's better to have your camera directly behind you. That's an interesting way of using this camera mechanic basically that isn't about just circling around an enemy.
Well, you bring up an interesting point because there's a strategic way to use it in Rocket League. So although you could accuse the camera lock of being a crutch, it turns something that would, because you would have to follow, otherwise you'd have to follow it yourself. Yes. It turns something that would normally be considered a crutch into a strategic element that you have to choose strategically.
And if you're really good, you can keep it all the time. But people like me, I need to turn it on.
But here's the thing: people it's still to this day it's still a really divisive mechanic too.
Specifically in Rocket League.
Well, specifically in Rocket League, but the example I was going to bring up, because I'm playing this game right now, is Conan Exiles. I was following the development, and when they brought in a lock-on mechanic, the whole community was like, yes, we need this. But the other half of the community was like, no, this is stupid, take it out of the game right now. It's funny how such a simple thing can actually get people so divisive. Same thing with Dark Souls.
Do you think it's because people see it as too much of a crutch, or that it's making
people see it as a crutch, and I don't think it is. I don't consider this a crutch the same way that cover-based shooting is.
If you introduce something to make something easier, and people have already become used to it and are proud at how they became used to it, they will be furious if you make it easier on everyone else. That's considered casualization.
Right, but I mean, like, the Dark Souls series is one of the most notoriously difficult series in gaming right now.
Yeah, and you will screw yourself up if you never lock on.
Yeah,
especially with some of the smaller guys who like lunge and your character's just like dink against the wall because he wasn't locked on.
But if you lock on too much, you're also going to screw yourself up.
Yes, a lot of players had a real rough time with Dark Souls 2 because they never thought that they could maybe not select all those guys when they're in a room full of 50 people.
It feels to me like this system should have just become synonymous with that kind of gameplay, and I wouldn't think that people would have like, oh, this is making it too easy when it's a part of one of the hardest game series in the
But again,
gaming.
why is it so freaking high on the list? Because it also only applies to a very specific type of game.
I wouldn't say that. Like our first example was a sports
Was
racing.
Rocket League. Okay, but Rocket League is also Rocket League is very unique.
But like you got MMOs, your character is always targeted.
Oh, but MMOs is completely different than this though, because MMOs you're not aiming.
No, I guess you're right.
You know, this you're actually like you have to swing your sword or shoot your bow and roll away and circle around the person. It's just it should be on the list, but it should be way.
It's just like
lower.
adjusting your camera isn't fun, and I think it deserves its spot on the list just because it allows players to focus on the fun part, chasing
What is
the
it,
ball.
number 3?
Something like that. What are we? What
Influential
are we at here?
gaming mechanics of all time, and this is number 3. Come
It's
on.
everywhere, man.
Come on.
Hey, I'm the host. Let's move on. Here's the thing. A few years later, there's a mechanic from Halo, which is our example here, that I think is more important, and I'll bring that up, but let's quickly discuss regenerating health. We just can't get away from the fact that we ranked this at the end of the last generation, because at the end of the last generation, every first-person shooter under the frickin' sun
And third person.
had completely abandoned health packs, and it was all wait till the blood falls off your face, and then you're good to go, which is, as we know, much more realistic, but still. Guys, do you have any thoughts on this? Because it's not that influential today, but it dominated that generation.
I still think it is very influential today. It's just we're not seeing as many of the kind of games that use it.
Okay.
And a regenerating shield still counts as regenerating health. Like Mass Effect doesn't have regenerating health, but your shield goes back and regenerates, and that's just functionally the exact same thing.
Absolutely. But you see games moving away from it and being praised by it, like the new Doom. Doom doesn't have any regenerating health. And they wove that into the mechanics quite well. What I really wanted to talk about, can you guys guess what mechanic from Halo, 2 mechanics actually, if you want to think about it, I would say are more influential than this?
One of them I would definitely say, and I agree with you, is grenade chucking without having to swap to the grenade.
It's essentially that. It's grenade chucking without having to swap to a grenade, a dedicated grenade button, and a dedicated melee button.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
If you talk about Half-Life, which is the most influential first-person shooter of all time, if you want to hit something with your crowbar, you got to switch to the crowbar. If you want to switch to a grenade, you switch to the grenade. Whereas Halo, and I think this really helped Halo feel a lot more frantic and cinematic, as you say, is how you can like shoot, throw a grenade, punch a guy, and then keep going very seamlessly. And I think I find that is something that we've kept. Although we're throwing out the regenerating health thing, we're really staying on to that, like dedicated melee button, dedicated grenade button. Hey guys who make PUBG, a dedicated melee button would be real good, by the way.
You were talking about that like 2 nights ago.
I was freaking
You were like,
out. I was
if I had a melee button.
Gosh, like guys in my face, I just want to hit him with my.
And I'm just like off looting, and you're like screaming in the microphone.
It's a really good point, though. You'd think someone would have come up with the idea of hitting someone with your gun before this, but yeah, Halo really kind of brought that in, and now it's pretty synonymous with FPSs. Yeah. No, that's a really good point.
Yeah,
Cool.
I mean, so much of this list could have just been Halo.
Yeah.
Halo mechanics.
We could have called this most influential mechanics of the 8th generation, 7th? I can never keep the generation straight. Okay, so forget the last thing I just said, which was most influential mechanics of the last generation, because here we are, the most influential mechanic of the 2nd console generation, I think? 3rd? Can never remember.
But this is
Jumping on people's heads, discuss, go.
It's important.
This is such a weird one, though. I mean, I agree, and I think it probably should be number 1. It's just so funny how all of the other mechanics on this list are so much newer, and then all of a sudden we just like whiplash back to 1982.
It is kind of weird, and if we were to do the rank again today, we might not put this at number 1. I feel like just the way jumping actually works in games has been more influential, specifically Mario. And what I mean by that is like how you have to build up some momentum with the character, and how when you land, you continue to have a little bit of momentum, which gives the character weight. There's plenty of documentaries out there talking to the Nintendo guys about how they talk about like if you have a character go boom and then immediately plant wherever he fell, that doesn't jive. It just doesn't feel good for the player, and especially because your mind knows that it doesn't work that way. Jumping onto an enemy's head, yeah, not sure this deserves to be number 1 anymore.
But for so long, even when
You think it does?
Oh, yeah.
Why?
Well, like I think Justin was about to agree with me.
I mean, 2D platformers still right when they made the transition from 2D to 3D. Famously, Nintendo was like, it's really hard to jump on enemies' heads from this perspective. So they gave Mario a little bit of a punch. He could take out, and then even in most recently in Odyssey, he can throw his hat at enemies. There are different ways to dispose of these little creatures. However, that being said, from a 2D perspective, it still works a lot. Like when you think about something like, and it is a throwback, but something like Shovel Knight, where you're like shoveling down on people, it feels really good, and it makes sense with a 2D like environment to have to interact with enemies that way.
It's a universal thing that you tell your mother or your grandmother, like, how do you kill an enemy in the game?
Jump on the head.
And they're just going to be like, oh, you jump on its head.
Oddly enough, if you jump on people's heads in real life, they will die. Okay, you know what? As you were talking, I got to thinking about it a little bit more, and I do believe that what's brilliant about this mechanic, and you just touched on it too, really, is this idea that they mixed combat in these old platformers in with the core mechanic of the game, which was jumping. So you didn't have to learn a new skill like shooting or aiming, because it's woven in already to this core mechanic of just like jumping from here to here. You jump onto this platform, you jump onto this dude. You complete different objectives using the same input.
And so what else would be like if you don't think they should be number 1, what else would be number 1?
Oh, I just changed my idea.
Oh, sweet.
I just changed my mind because like after kind of just thinking about it that way.
Good job.
Yeah.
Hey, we did it. We've come to a consensus.
But we've come to the end of the list too. So if you guys think there's a much more influential mechanic out there, if you think we were smoking crack when we did this list, and most importantly, if there are other WatchMojo top 10s that you love and you want to see us deconstruct them, or that you had issues with and you want to see us deconstruct, let us know in the comments. I will now thank Andrew and Justin for joining me today. Thank you guys for making it this far in the video, if you have, and we'll see you next time.
See you.
Bye.
Thanks for watching Mojo Plays. Be sure to subscribe and click on the link in the description below to check out our suggestion page and vote on what content you'd like to see us cover next.